Hello. Following the commemorations of D-Day that we've been watching over the last few days, I thought it would be an excellent time to look at wartime sewing patterns. So the sewing patterns produced from 1939 to 1945. These are original examples from my collection, and the one that I can't wait to show you is this one, which is a Siren suit. And if you're like me, you'll wonder how practical Siren suits were. I always wondered how they went to the loo in them. And this one is particularly interesting because if we zoom in on the back, I'm still not sure how practical this is, but if we zoom in on the back, we can see that there is a button down flap, and even the belt has buttonholes, so you didn't need to take off the top part of the suit. You could just pull down the trousers pants at the back. I think it would be an interesting one to make and see how that actually works. Of course, at this time, fashion became very practical. It attempted to combine practicality with glamour. In fact, Elsa Schiaparelli actually introduced a shocking pink jumpsuit. Actually, while we're looking at the Siren suit, one of the reasons that this era holds such an appeal for me is that I grew up in London and come from a London family that saw some relatives evacuated as children from London during World War II. Others experienced bombing and wartime rationing. I grew up with stories of this era, and in some ways it was more real to me than any other. You couldn't give it a bit of chocolate or banana without being told how many years. I never saw an orange or... But the Siren suit reminded me of a story. One relation, they built Anderson shelters in their gardens to go into during the raids. And when the war finished, the chap went out to take apart the Anderson shelter, and she just gave it like an initial little tap with a spade to loosen it up. In the whole thing that they'd been sheltering in during the bombing all that time just came down at the first tap like a house of cards. And much of women's fashion took inspiration from the military uniforms around at the time. So there is this cute little sailor suit with the wide-legged pants trousers, because of course during this time too women were taking over men's jobs in aeroplane factories, in all kinds of factories. They were doing men's work and they needed practical clothing. What better way than to take inspiration from patriotic war uniforms? So there's that little pants sailor suit, and also I have this original pattern for a sailor suit. I love these nautical themed outfits. Of course, there was the Women's Land Army too, and also, just if you were at home, there was the Dig for Victory, because with food rationing and transport difficulties, it wasn't that easy to move food from the countryside into cities like London. So we see outfits like this with the cut-off trousers pants, which I think are really cute, and you can imagine those girls digging for victory. Not only food rationing but fabric rationing, and there were rules that meant all the frills and flounces of the 1930s had to go. They weren't allowed on these clothes. Hemlines became shorter, and this is a classic 1940s design because as the puffy sleeves that consumed all that fabric went, they still wanted to create hourglass shapes. So we see the introduction of shoulder pads and these extended lines of the shoulders, which still then created that hourglass shape. Raised hemlines, but without the frills and flounces of the 30s. They became really inventive at adding interest to the garment. For example, you can see with this stripy dress how they vary the direction of the stripes to create interest. I love these little conical pockets. You see some really interesting pocket designs during the 40s because, again, those little conical pockets didn't take out much fabric and they just add that little touch of interest to the dress. And with these dresses, although we still see what actually looks like a puff sleeve, in fact the effect is created often in these 40s dresses. The top of the sleeve is pleated and extended with shoulder pads, so you're still actually not using as much fabric as you would have done in the 30s. And then we've got the extra interest of the lace up fronts. And here's a very classic 1940s blouse, very tailored, quite boxy. You can see she's got her glamorous Rita Hayworth hairstyle, and the interest is provided by the patch pockets and the pleats at the back, and often you might not have enough fabric with fabric rationing to create the whole blouse. So there were lots in these patterns, lots of opportunities for colour blocking, so that you could use 2 different fabric remnants if you needed to. And then we've got this little pinafore dress. Pinafore dresses were hugely popular during the wartime because, of course, they're so versatile, and there were recommendations to make your pinafore dress in something like grey wool flannel, something very practical, and then you would add interest by making a little stripy blouse. And of course, if you were following your make, do and mend, your stripy blouse might be made from your husband's pyjamas while he was off at war. To add interest to your tailored dresses where you weren't allowed those frills and flounces, there were very inventive ways they had to make their dresses glamorous and interesting. And we can see here clever use of those button details to add interest. Also the extended shoulder line, and of course, as you can see from my outfit, which is a true vintage 1940s wartime dress, patriotic red, blue and white was very popular as a colourway because it was seen as a duty for women to look glamorous during this era, because if you looked defeated sure, I look defeated sometimes. If you look defeated, then you were sort of giving in to the enemy and lowering the morale of troops. So it was a duty to dress up, to wear your red lipstick, to be patriotic, to keep up spirits. One of the effects, actually, to show you another pattern while I talk. A pattern which, similarly to the last one I showed you, has this lace-up detail, but also shows how colour blocking might be used to both create interest but also give you an opportunity to use up different fabrics if you didn't have enough of one fabric. Yes, patriotic duty to keep up appearances, as well as wearing red, white and blue and red lipstick. One of the, especially in France, where of course they were under Nazi occupation, one of the protests against Hitler was to wear really gigantic hats, and that was a way that women could show that they were not defeated, that your big hat was a way to say, I'm still proud, I'm proud to be French, and it was a protest against Hitler. And in fact, I'm sure I've read somewhere that shops like Elsa Schiaparelli's were closed at times during the war years for doing out the shop window in red, white and blue as a patriotic gesture. Another little example of these shortened hemlines, but how you could still create that desired hourglass figure with your extended shoulders. And you see a lot in 40s fashion, gathering of fabric at the hips, and between the extended shoulders and the gathering of fabric at the hips, you've created that hourglass look. And then the little turn up cuffs just create that little pop of colour, and that was a really popular thing too, just to add a little pop of colour. If you didn't have very much and you perhaps had clothes in sensible colours, you could add little pops of colour, which is why you often see me wear 1940s fingerless crochet gloves. They are true vintage 40s, and they were easy way to add a little pop of colour. And of course, other accessories. People made their own hats out of all kinds of things they had at home. I've seen a French magazine from this time where they used Christmas decorations to make hats. Wool, of course, also rationed, but there were really affecting show you another pattern while I talk. So another example of how to create interest in a dress where you haven't got fabric for frills and flounces. We've got the addition of scallops down the front, or you might have, this is a copy of a true vintage pattern, you might have a little bit of satin at the front. That would be like if you had a satin back crepe, you could turn it over and just add that little extra interesting detail to the front. Another copy of a vintage pattern, and I love, it's Marion Martin, I love the playful use of stripes again and those diagonal button details. Something else to bear in mind was of course the fabric and wool, but all the uniforms that were required. So of course not only is fabric in short supply, but it was really needed to make uniforms for all those men and women in different ways going to war. And one of the most touching things I think about this time was of course the men in their tents in France in winter were really cold, and I'm sure you know about the knitting socks and balaclavas and mittens, but it's really lovely to see at the time the heartfelt thank yous that were written to organisations like the Women's Institute to thank them for the really welcome socks and mittens and things that helped keep those men warm during the winter. And many women actually used up ration coupons from their own books to knit for men at the front. So I think much is said about vintage style, not vintage values, and of course there are lots of problematic things about this time in terms of attitude. But it wasn't all bad. The rationing system that affected everyone meant that there was a general pulling together. It was very equalising. Everyone joined a common cause. So I think we shouldn't forget that aspect. And then just to illustrate as well the playfulness with stripes, we've got this cute little blouse, and then there's this pattern which I have made up. It's a lovely pattern. It's got this really interesting kind of pinafore front that curves around to create these pockets and extended shoulders. So it's a pattern right from the start of the war at 1940, and I did make up that dress, and I love this pattern. Something that's often said about vintage patterns is that they tend to be in small sizes, and there was one thing, at the risk of being shot down in flames myself, that I did want to correct around vintage sizing. It's often said that, you know, survival bias, that the larger patterns were used a lot and the larger clothes were used, and therefore those have ceased to exist, where the smaller ones that weren't used are still around. And while it's true that it's much easier, we're seeing upcycling now, that it's much easier to cut down larger clothes to make smaller clothes. National statistics and records do show that people actually were smaller then, and I don't think it's hard to understand why. Food was rationed, and as I was growing up, my family would talk about food rationing, and sugar was rationed. They didn't see chocolate, and there were stories about what was in the larder. Things like, one chap like really vividly remembers tins of M&V. M&V stood for meat and veg. You didn't know exactly what meat or veg. So in the larder, tins of M&V, this is in London, and Spam. People didn't graze and snack. There wasn't really things to graze and snack on. And in London, you wouldn't even have fresh eggs, you'd have powdered eggs in the main. So there were meal times with your family. You wouldn't have snacked and taken food from the rest of your family. But also, would you want to break into the larder and snack on a tin of M&V? I think you would. On top of that, petrol was rationed, so people walked and cycled vast distances. The sad stories told to me by someone who was evacuated during the war, and of course children were evacuated from London. Actually, as it turned out, they were evacuated when London was quite safe and brought back just as it became really dangerous. And he remembers cycling back from school and waving goodbye to his friend, and they went different ways, and as he turned round, his friend was blown up on his bicycle. With all these stories growing up, it is a time that touches me very deeply. And then the other aspect, as well as the walking and cycling, and the fact that children played outside, they weren't in playing computer games, they were playing outside. And of course, women had really punishing housework schedules. You didn't need to go to the gym if you were having to push clothes through a mangle. There weren't the labour-saving devices. Housework demanded a lot of energy. I think we can definitely say that a lot of calories would have been used up. Walking, cycling, heavy housework duties, no processed food available, little sugar, foods, to me anyway, slightly unappetizing. Things like cheese and butter rations. I can't help believing those statistics that said people were smaller. And because my family were around in those times and I grew up listening to their memories, I kind of just don't want their truth overwritten. The ever popular peasant blouse, seen in the 30s, still around in the 40s. Love them. You could wear them today, couldn't you, without looking like you in costume. Of course, the slip, people wore the slips under their dresses then to stop skirts clinging to your legs, and very good idea. It's got my little slip pattern. And then we have, I love these patterns. It's for a house dress. I absolutely think we should be bringing them back. So this little house dress, you see it's quite comfy. You could wear it obviously around the house. But if you wanted to just nip out for little errands, see here there's the option for either long, keep your legs warm, or shorter as kind of more of a dress rather than a house robe. And a cute little night dress that could also easily be a house dress. And of course, pairs of pyjamas, because in a statement of the obvious, it was jolly chilly. No central heating back then. And I hope that you will like this video, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.